Welcome everybody. Welcome back. It's a great pleasure to have with us today Radhika Desai. Radhika, for those who do not know her yet, is professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. And lately, very recently, she's also been appointed as a visiting professor of the London School of Economics. Most of us know you, Radhika, because you're also the host of the popular YouTube show Geopolitical Economy Hour, which is hosted in the Geopolitical Economy Report. That is the YouTube channel of Ben Norton. And among other things, among other books and works that you publish, I want to mention just the latest, which it was published in 2023, and I'm gonna show it right now. Just one second. There it is. And the latest book that you publish is called Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy. Now, this book is it can be totally downloaded for free, so it doesn't need to be purchased. So for those who are interested, can just go on this website. I will leave the link in the description and you can download it and read it. And the most important, the most interesting, at least, part of this book is that it investigates the decay of the neoliberal financialized capitalism, which it has been revealed, especially in the crisis of the coronavirus pandemic. A crisis that, it was, let's say, triggered by the pandemic, but not caused by the pandemic. That is very, very, very important. And one of the key points of this book that personally I found interesting is that we've been brainwashed about neoliberalism, about the ideology of less state, etc., etc. But all of this works up until a big crisis comes up, because when a big crisis is coming up, then maybe the state is needed even to save capitalism from its own crisis. So with you, let's go and rebuild a little bit, the entire history, and let's try to understand a little bit better the age that we are living in at the moment. And I would start from 2008, and because 2008, we had a big financial crisis, and the subsequent response that has been provided by the capitalist governments and have further undermined the productive foundation of capitalism. So can you explain how the post-2008 period has impacted the long-term trajectory of capitalism?
Sure. As you rightly said, I argue that the major crisis but actually a whole series of crises that have hit capitalism over the last many decades are actually a direct result of the neoliberalism and financialization that have reigned in these economies since, I would say, well, basically since the onset of the neoliberal era in starting, let's just put it, in the 1980s, although there are some deeper roots in the 1970s. And of course, you know that the Chilean experiment with neoliberalism dates back earlier to 1973. But nevertheless, basically the adoption of neoliberal policies is the sort of the causes of many of the deeper crises. And that's ironic, because neoliberalism in its time during the 1970s and 80s, when it was just starting out, it was portrayed as the solution to the growth slowdown that Western capitalism experienced in the 1970s. Beginning, some people would date it from the late 1960s. The growth slowdown and the stagflationist 1970s were the period of incubation of neoliberalism, where this previously marginalized set of ideas became center stage, and essentially since then they have ruled as the ruling policy paradigm in all major Western neoliberal societies. And the idea was that the idea behind neoliberalism was that, what has caused the growth slowdown? There were two possible explanations. One is that the growth slowdown had been caused because capitalism was essentially incapable of, restarting growth, that in fact in the post-Second World War period it had experienced its golden age, or the big long boom of the post-Second World War period, not because of a capitalism's own dynamic, but because of the heavy reforms, socialistic reforms, as Eric Hobsbawm would have called them, that were implemented in the post-Second World War period because economies needed to be reconstructed, working classes were very organized and strong, and so on. So these socialistic reforms had created the big boom, the post-Second World War boom. And that if nevertheless the underlying capitalism had created a crisis in the 1970s, the solution was to deepen these socialistic reforms. But of course, the voices that were articulating this option were faint, and they were not particularly strong in their conviction in Western countries, because essentially the Marxist analysis of capitalism had been weakened, not just in the post-Second World War period, but also in the decades previously, throughout the 20th century, if not a little bit earlier. The dominant strains of Marxism in Western countries have lost any connection with Marx's real analysis of capitalism. So they were not strong. They did not have the courage of their convictions. So instead of that option being taken, the neoliberal option was taken. The neoliberal option said that the cause of the crisis, the cause of the problems, are all these socialistic reforms, this nationalization, tolerance of trade unions, strong trade unions, regulation of industry, the policy of full employment, etc. And we have to pursue the opposite policies and give capital greater freedom. So the idea was that neoliberalism would release capitalism from the burdens of state regulation and social obligation. And this would free capitalism to produce growth, and it would be fantastic, and capitalism would reacquire its dynamism, its productive dynamism, and everything would be fine. So that was the idea. But if you look at what really has happened since the 1980s onwards, what you see is that compared to previous decades, even compared to the crisis-prone 1970s, the growth performance of most of these economies has been substantially lower. Growth has been low, investment has been low, unemployment has been higher. And also, of course, in the 1970s, inflation was higher, and for a time in the 80s and 90s, it became low again. But since then, we have also had a considerable inflation, as we see now. We can discuss that, the ins and outs of that a little bit later. But so we basically have seen much weaker economic performance. So you asked about the longer term history of and trajectory of capitalism. Well, one of the conclusions to which I come in Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, which is much stronger than in my previous book, Geopolitical Economy, which is also for me quite important, which was published in 2013. So the conclusion I come to is that if you look at the history of capitalism from a long-term point of view, Marx had said very early on, in volume 3 of Capital particularly, he points out specifically in chapter 27, that once capitalism arrives at the monopoly stage, then essentially it has exhausted its capacity to be historically progressive, and nor will it be particularly productively dynamic. And therefore, it will have become ripe for transition to socialism. And many people around that time were kind of, they were already sort of denaturing Marx's analysis. And, you had the revisionist Bernstein and all these sorts of things. So in that context, this kind of insight was lost sight of, although not by everyone. So, for example, Lenin, he did point out that in 1916, in his very famous pamphlet, Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism, that capitalism has reached its highest stage. And I would say that that judgment was roughly correct, because if you look at it from the point of view of today, you can see very clearly that, as I was saying, The golden age boom was not because of capitalism's intrinsic dynamism, but because of the socialistic reforms, which provided particularly a vast increase in demand, because working class consumption went up, and particularly in Western countries. And so there was a vast expansion of demand, and that created favorable conditions for investment. And so you had a big boom. But once you got the turn to neoliberalism, which turned back many of these socialistic reforms, and also in places where they did not turn them back completely, they kind of undermined them from within. So for example, in Britain we have the National Health Service, but it has been hollowed out through contracting out and privatization and so on. So what you have seen under neoliberalism is that capitalism's productive dynamism has not returned. And instead of a productively dynamic capitalism, we have witnessed financialization. So, and this is my final set of points I'm going to make. So, because all the profits that were being accumulated by capital, particularly in a context where neoliberalism was actively undermining working classes, undermining their ability to fight for higher wages and so on, what you began to see is that the profits generated by capital were not being productively reinvested. They were being reinvested instead in financialized form. So instead of the classic Marxist formulation M dash, where you take money, you invest it in production, and you produce commodities of a higher value, and you sell them for more money than you started out with, what you are getting is the circuit M dash, where people expect money to make money. And that's what, and they do it through either by predatory lending or through speculation, both of which produce nothing of value, and they are harmful to the productive economy. So we have witnessed financialization. And of course, finally, therefore, you asked about the 2008 crisis, and of course also the pandemic financial crisis that we have seen. We have witnessed essentially a type of capitalism that is being productively weakened. Outsourcing is has been a big tendency within this, and so you weaken capitalism productively in the homelands of capitalism, and instead of productive activity, money has gone in the direction of financial activity. And as a result of that, if you look at any account of the incidence of financial crisis, you will see that for a short period between about 1945, 1950 to about 1980, you have practically no major financial crises. But after that, you have seen increasingly frequent and deep financial crisis, of which the crisis of 2008 was one, and of course the pandemic crisis was another. And one final set of points, and that is that in the course of this neoliberal era, what you have seen is, of course, when neoliberalism started, of course, it was imposing a lot of economic harm and so on. But that was being inflicted on economies that were still relatively robust, thanks to the golden age of growth and so on. But 40 years down the road, neoliberalism, the harms that neoliberalism is now imposing, it is imposing on economies that have become considerably weakened. And therefore, 2008 was a bit of a turning point, because there was this big financial crisis originating in the United States. One thing I like to say about that crisis is it was not a global financial crisis. It was a North Atlantic financial crisis, because the overwhelming majority of the investment that was made in the toxic securities that were being generated by the American financial system came from the United States itself, of course, from the UK, and much of it from continental European financial institutions that had been experiencing considerable deregulation in the context of the launch of the euro and the financial deregulation that went alongside that. So it was very much a North Atlantic financial crisis. And the reason why this was a bit of a turning point is capitalism was now considerably weakened by neoliberalism. And this was another hit that came. And despite first of all, there was a lot of talk about how there should be a fiscal response and governments should take up investment and so on. But actually, thanks to the political power of financial capital, the fiscal response remained very weak. There was this so-called monetary response, which is a response of essentially easy money policy. But rather than reviving the real economy, all it did was it further exacerbated the tendency to create asset bubbles, so that we may have lost the housing and credit bubbles, but we are now in an everything bubble. And that, I would say, we are already in the phase of its bursting. That phase began with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, and we have a continuing crisis in a number of asset markets. That includes the market for treasuries. It includes the much talked about commercial real estate crisis and many others.
Thank you very much. I believe, there's an interesting point that you mentioned in this in this explanation, which is, the fact that it is a North Atlantic crisis, and I fully agree on that. And what it seemed like, at least to me, is that, of course, the United States entered into this crisis. The response of this crisis, it was, they did basically neoliberal politics and everything, and the crisis, it was dumped over the weaker country. So, the European country they tend to be a little bit subaltern to the United States, that just received the FTEC, and even us, that we dumped in our own way, to whom? To the internal classes that are weaker, so the working class and so on. And they saw those politics of austerity that we are seeing even today, and even today we are seeing, even more. So I fully agree with you when you say that, the monopolistic tendencies that you highlighted, in capitalism, and especially, this financialization of capitalism itself, is leading to a senile form of capitalism that is no longer progressive. It's no longer progressive at all, because it doesn't produce. So we have our world that is going into this direction. We have, we can see that even the Ukrainian war is going. It is the last answer, just to keep grasp markets, and so on, and for the big investment groups to make a fair. But then we also have another side of the world that it seems like now is raising, the head once again, and even stronger, I believe, than what happened in the 20th century. And so what is the role that you believe they can play, for instance, the BRICS, the south of the world, into this scenario? Are they going to provide? Do you believe they're going to provide an alternative to the capitalism as we know it? And what are the future scenario that you see?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very big question. But let me begin by just introducing, just adding to another point you made when you were talking, and then I'll come to the question. So, you pointed out that capitalism, it's very clear now that capitalism is senile, it's no longer historically productive because it does not produce. But there's another element to it. Marx really deeply believed, and I think there is a sense in which it is very true, that mode of production is historically progressive, which is capable of developing the forces of production. And I would say that today, there are many areas of technology, for example, ICT, or information and communication technology, AI, whatever all sorts of other things, where the green technology, where the private ownership of the means of production, which is a necessity in capitalism, is acting as an impediment to the further development of the forces of production, to innovation, to technological development, in ways that would enhance the well-being of humanity. Because at the end of the day, essentially what Marx was saying is that as long as capitalism seems to develop the forces of production, thereby, enhancing the well-being of humanity in some broad fashion, then it will be tolerated, or so long as it's benefiting enough people, it'll be tolerated. But today, that is also a problem. So I just wanted to add that point and leave that for people to think about, because I'm sure there are many people who think this. Now, you were asking about the BRICS, and I would like to say, I would like to divide my answer again into a number of points. The first and most important point is that we use the term BRICS, and that covers 4 countries. And of course, now as an organization, it has many other members. However, one of these, namely China, stands out. It is the single most important challenge to Western domination of the world economy. All the other BRICS are much lesser challenges. Okay, that's very important to underline, and I'll come to that in a minute. So China, and China is not just any old country; it is the leading socialist economy of our time. So to me, it's very important that in appreciating why China is so productively dynamic. Why it has also, by the way, managed to keep its financial sector well under control. And every so often, when it has seemed to go out of control, it has been brought back into control. So that's also good. So, and so socialism is important precisely in the context where we are talking about the senile and unproductive capitalism, whereas socialism is proving itself to be productively much more dynamic. And that is a very important thing. And finally, one other point is that in this book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, I feel that I have managed to discuss the role of socialism in the history of capitalism in a meaningful way. Because if you think about it, if you had the Russian Revolution, the first of the major socialist revolutions, already occurring in 1917, much earlier than most of the people were expecting, particularly Western Marxists were expecting. And this is like barely a century into the development of capitalism, of industrial capitalism anyway. So this revolution, and so there is a certain systematic relationship between socialism and capitalism. And one of the points that I make both here and in the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group, which I convene, one of the points we make is that the advance of socialism is not just the task of the working class. And particularly, there's a tendency to believe that the Western working class has to play the leading role. I think that what is very clear, both from reading Marx, but also from reading history, is that socialism can and must advance both through class struggles and struggles of nations for their own survival. And what you see both in the case of the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and all the other revolutions that have taken place, they have been as much against capitalism as they have been against imperialism. And so socialism advances through by attacking both. So that's where the significance of socialism comes in, because you can have capitalist countries like India that do represent in some meaningful sense, although today this meaningful sense a challenge to the imperialist order. This was particularly true in the early decades of independence, although today it is less true, I would think, especially under the government of Modi. But nevertheless, the challenges of countries like India tend to be much weaker than challenged by a country like China. And the principal reason is that because they are capitalist countries, or for that matter, Brazil or South Africa, and until recently, Russia, we'll come back to Russia later, but because they have substantial capitalist classes who are eager to ally closely with Western capitalist classes, then the challenge is blunted to a substantial extent. So that's a very key point that I'd like to make. So China is very much far in advance. Socialism is important. So now we look at the other BRICS. What has happened with the other BRICS is that they tend to continue the tendency to elect to power governments that serve what are essentially what we used to call comprador capitalist classes. That, so again, with Jair Bolsonaro's government in Brazil or the Modi government today in India, we have still forms of government that are actually setting back the development of these countries and their ability to pose real challenges to the Western order. These are also governments that are actually quite inclined to subordinate themselves to the West. Both politically and economically, both in terms of international politics and in terms of the international economy. So in that sense, also there are lesser challenges. So, but at the same time, I do feel, despite making those, accepting those points, despite this, I feel that there is a great future for the BRICS. And this is for the following reason. Actually, there are not very many favorable options available to the BRICS in terms of allying with the West. Today, all the West has to offer any country that seeks to ally with them, and by the way, that even includes prosperous and politically powerful countries like the European countries, let alone various third world countries like India or Brazil or what have you. All they have to offer is a form of economic subordination that imposes burdens on that society while also sucking value out of that society, chiefly through the dollar denominated financial system of which you are compelled to be a part. So, to me, this kind of relationship has really not much recommended, because today, even someone like Modi, who is to me essentially a fascist leader, even someone like Modi has to provide some minimal level of economic stability within the country. Otherwise, he cannot hope to win elections, which is why, although his personal inclinations are to run into the embrace of the United States, he has actually been constrained from doing so. So everybody praises the fact that Indian foreign policy has been quite independent in the context of the Ukraine conflict and so on. But the reason for that is not that somehow Modi is a great judge of what should be done and a progressive thinker. On the contrary, he's none of those things. But rather that the conduct of Indian foreign policy has been largely left to civil servants. The current Indian foreign minister is a former civil servant. And they are essentially conducting India's foreign policy within certain broad parameters, which, are seen as independent. In fact, India should be leading the way towards making peace, not just making peace with China and intensifying its relationship with Russia, but you don't see it doing that. And but despite their inclinations, the parameters within which they have to operate actually do not favor alliance with the West. So I think in the long run, no matter how many times these countries, whether India, Brazil, South Africa, or any of the other countries, uh, no matter how much they make attempts to try to ally with the West, those attempts will fail because the West has less and less to offer. And those political forces, and this will embolden political forces in these countries to say, no, we have a very different future. We should not go for unbridled neoliberal financialized capitalism. We need to think of a more hybrid system, a more socialistic system. And that will eventually, after perhaps many mistakes, hopefully as few as possible, set them on a path away from capitalism, which, as I say, has exhausted its capacity to benefit humankind or the citizen of any country, really, even the homelands of capitalism.
No, that's very interesting, and I mean, it brings back at least, I mean, to another key point, because you're right. I mean, it seems like capitalism, neoliberalism, the West in general, has nothing to offer anymore, and you know, let's say China above all, and the south of the world, they're fully understanding that. I mean, it is clear because. Even when before you mentioned, the economic growth of Europe during the second half of the 20th century, yeah, that it was possible, and it was possible because the south of the world, it was fully exploited. Basically the capitalism of the north of the world, they managed to keep salaries a little bit higher simply because they were exploiting completely the south of the world. Then what happened? It is that, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union, it counterbalanced everything because at least in Europe, the way that we interpret the whole thing, we perceive it, is that if we had a social welfare, we only had it because the Soviet Union was there, and the fear of revolution. It made it possible to the capitalistic government of the single state to offer and give and share a little bit more. Soviet Union is not there anymore. They took everything back. Neoliberal politics just applied, and here we are with austerity and all those situations that we see. So what happened, and this is an interesting piece, and I would like also um, to have your opinion, is that in those years, okay, in the only one thought, basically, the moment where the English dollar and United States were the only way of thinking in the world. So basically, collapse of the Soviet Union up until a few years ago. Um, the United States thought, I mean, the United States government, of course, the neoliberals, but the neocons thought that maybe China would have been integrated inside the global capitalistic system. So I mean, they even made stronger investments. I mean, they made, they built even more factories than in the 20 the end of the 20th century, and they thought that maybe they would have made China shift into those neoliberal politics, but something it went wrong. Something went completely wrong. So at the moment, we start hearing, because something went wrong and China is basically opposing to the imperialistic policies and, I mean, to the dominance of the Western world and everything, we started talking in the Western propaganda about the Beijing consensus, the Beijing consensus, as if China is now having this key role and it's imposing, like Washington is imposing the Washington consensus, China is imposing the Beijing consensus. Now, I think that is not real. China doesn't do business in the same way that the West does business. But I would like to hear your opinion and hear from you explaining if this is the case, or I mean, can we speak about the Beijing consensus at all?
Um, well, first of all, not in the same way as the Washington consensus. I think that there are today two very different models of economy. One is, like I say, the neoliberal financialized capitalist economy, and the other is the kind of hybrid socialism that China is basically experimenting with. So in that sense, there are perhaps two models. But I think China is very careful to say, and I think it is correct to say, that it does not impose its policies on anyone else. And perhaps that is, you see, China, it is not for China to impose its policies on other countries, but it is for other countries to look at what China is getting right and learn from it and adapt it for themselves to their own circumstances as their own policies, as policies that relate to the needs of the productive economy, the needs to create a more egalitarian society, a more green society. All these things are imperative today, and so in that sense, I would say that one of the expressions I use is that as you know, China is today the most important trading partner for most of the countries of the world, and that is quite a remarkable achievement, and it has been achieved in a relatively short period of time. But at the same time, so I say that countries are, of course, benefiting from being a partner of China, but they should also be learning from China. They should also be treating China, if not quite as a model, because China had a revolution. Unless you have a revolution, you cannot replicate that model at all. I mean, and even then, your conditions would be quite different. But nevertheless, all the progressive political forces in these countries should be looking at China and learning from China and adapting what it's getting right for their own economies. So in that sense, I would say that if not there is a Beijing consensus, there is certain a Beijing toolkit, let's put it that way, from which countries should be borrowing in order to make their own countries more equal, more productive, less financialized, more green, and all those things.
That's very good to know. Thank you very much. Let's go back 1 second to the book, yeah, to Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. Can you elaborate a little bit more how basically the pandemic exposed the fundamental weakness and contradiction of the neoliberal capitalism?
Right. So, this book actually began with an article that I wrote in March 2020, just the weekend after we were told that we will not be meeting at university anymore, go back, we will teach by Zoom. And I said, what's Zoom? And and at that time, I wrote an article called Coronavirus and Capitalism, The Unexpected Reckoning. And already then I knew that there were two aspects to this. Number one, it was already becoming clear that once you had a shutdown, people would lose their jobs, people would be constrained in terms of what they could buy and whatever, etc. That all the inadequacies of capitalism, the fact that it was not productive, would Western economies be able to produce all the things that were needed to attack the crisis, the personal protective equipment, the medications, the all sorts of other things, would they be able to produce these things? So it would expose the weaknesses of capitalism as they had already become very acute before the pandemic came along. and it would exacerbate these weaknesses. It would make them much worse because a lot of productive capacity would be lost. You can shutting down things is much easier than building them up. So all the small companies that would go out of business, etc., many of them would be lost forever. People would scatter, and so on. So in that sense, so to me, the coronavirus pandemic both exposed as well as exacerbated the weaknesses of neoliberal capitalism, and I would say that that's a judgment that has been proved right. And I also said one other thing, which is that neoliberalism has involved essentially, it has actually not involved small state. The state is actually quite active, and it cannot but be active, because capitalism is so contradictory. One of the points I make in this book, as a theoretical points I make, is that to talk about like a small state is not possible under capitalism, because capitalism is so contradictory that it requires state intervention. And also, in all the examples we have had of successful capitalist development in the world today, by which we mean most of the Western countries, but also China, South Korea, and so on, Japan, all of them have had quite interventionist states, because that's what you need to create even capitalist development, let alone any other kind of development. So states have always been very involved. But for the last 50 odd years of neoliberalism, we have had state intervention of a different sort, which is heavily oriented towards essentially state intervention in favor of capital and against labor. So in this, and so this sort of state intervention has meant that many of the capacities you need to protect an entire population against a disease, because now you also have to protect labor. I mean, at the end of the day, you need your labor, right? So how are you going to protect labor? That capacity to protect your population has been lost. And that therefore, what Habermas used to call the coping mechanisms are also gone. So, there's he wrote this book, Legitimation Crisis, in which he called the crisis of crisis management. So we are looking at the crisis of crisis management in a big way, because Western countries have not proved very good at managing the coronavirus crisis, because the capacity to manage the crisis in having a strong state bureaucracy capable of, deploying various sorts of initiatives, etc., they are all gone. The only capacities we have in terms of state capacities are capacities to aid big, giant monopoly corporations, subsidize them, bail them out, allow them to become financialized, etc. We have very little other capacity.
No, and that is very true, because I mean, the reality, it's very hard to manage a pandemic when for years you've been destroying the public health system. I mean, especially in Europe, I understand that in the States is different, or maybe in Canada it's closer to the Europe, but I mean, especially in Europe, especially in Italy, I mean, if year after years you just cut fundings for the health public health system, then of course you do not have any seats inside the hospital anymore. You do not have anything. And then, I mean, if a crisis is coming up, then of course you do not know how to respond, because you totally dismantled everything and you just offered austerity. And the other thing that you say that is very interesting, which I can relate and we can relate today, is the fact that the investments that have been made, even, I mean, during neoliberalism, were not toward work, but toward the capital. And that is key, because we see today, then when we are told that the only possibility for the European states to actually go over the funds and overspend is because of military defense, basically. So basically it's in weapons. So if the states are going to invest in weapons, then they can go over the budget. Otherwise, they need to stay within the budget that is dimmer and dimmer. So tell me how it's going to help people, and I mean, living in Europe, in the States, and in the Western world in general. Just going toward the conclusion, because unfortunately I have a really hard stop. But I mean, what is coming up, and what we clearly see is that even this is being seen even by people that are not Marxist. Okay, is that we cannot continue with capitalism. We cannot continue in this way. And at the same way, though, what we were mentioning before, even the BRICS, which represents pretty much, the alternative to that, even if they're together more because they know what they do not want than what they really are. Um, the BRICS, is they're really being, united and being blocked against this war. But what is it, according to your opinion, that is keeping them really together? What is tying them?
I think there are two things. One is, I have already mentioned the unattractiveness of the West. There is nothing to gain from the West. The West cannot pick them off and bring them to itself because it has nothing to attract. But the other part is, which I haven't mentioned, is the economic gravity of China. That is the magnetic force that China exerts over everyone else, for the simple reason that, as opposed to the West, it has a great deal to offer. It has capital to offer, it has technology to offer, it has cheap goods to offer, it has investment to offer, all sorts of things. So that is what is broadly keeping them together. So even, not just the BRICS countries that are formally members of the BRICS organization, but also practically all the members of the world majority, as the Russians now increasingly call the world that is the non-Western, non-capitalist, non-Western oriented world. But also, I would say countries like Japan. I mean, Japan is, part of the West, but it is kind of isolated from the West. It sits right next to China, right next to Russia for that matter. And I would say that the Japanese, while they often seem to be kowtowing to the West, to use a very Japanese expression, they have continued to have their very deep economic involvement with the Chinese economy. They have managed to either evade or somehow get the US to soften the various sanctions that they are imposing, not just on China, but also on Russia, because Japan is a very technologically sophisticated manufacturing economy still, in major ways, more so than the United States. And it relies on things like Russian energy and so on, and it has not broken that. So the economic gravity of China holds them together. And finally, I would say that the pressure from below, I mean, people may not be the most organized force, in most Western countries. They may not be organized in recognizably popular or communist parties or anything. But if you don't give the people the minimum, you are not going to be able to retain power. And it doesn't matter whether you are democratically elected or you are an authoritarian regime, it doesn't matter. You have to keep some minimal level of public satisfaction. And so that also, because the West has so little to offer, is only going to push the world away from Western countries and towards China, and presumably, hopefully, to more complex and interesting forms of cooperation with one another.
Radhika, really thank you very much for this conversation. I hope we will have a few more in the future. Compatibly, of course, with your time, your work, and everything else. But thank you very much. It has been a pleasure, and I
Well,
wish you all
great
the
pleasure
best.
for me too, Luca. That was really, really fun. Yeah.